Welcome to Meet the Candidates. I'm Lou Young, and with us is Michael Sussman, a statewide candidate for New York Attorney General who is on the November ballot. Michael is a renowned civil rights attorney, most famously known as the architect of the landmark desegregation case in the city of Yonkers. Although he was a lifelong Democrat, he has been nominated by the Green Party and thinks this is the year for a third-party candidate to prevail. Welcome, sir.
Good to see you.
And let me begin by asking outright, why run as a Democrat? Why not run as a Democrat? The other candidates stepped up. They had a primary, but you chose another path. Why?
The simple answer is there's a duopoly of corruption in New York State. Both political parties are part of it. There has to be another way.
So you just walked away from the Democratic Party?
I did. I felt the Democratic Party was not a party in this state for significant change, campaign finance reform, bail reform, many of the issues that need to be dealt with in the state. The Democratic Party has had an opportunity to deal with them for generations. They have failed, as has the Republican Party.
But why not let the voters decide?
They're going to have a chance to decide. That's why I'm going to be on the ballot. They will have an opportunity to make a decision. Neither party has any entitlement to power in New York. The voters of the state are entitled to a broader choice. Democratic Party is going to run its candidate. Republican Party is going to run its candidate. The Green Party has me.
All the candidates I've heard speak about the AG's office as the state's defender. Yeah. In fact, I believe 70% of what the AG's office does is defend the state of New York from lawsuits from individuals. How could you change that? Or could you change it? Do you want to change it?
You better change it. A great deal of resources are being spent in the New York State Attorney General's office defending practices which are really indefensible. I've had the experience as a lawyer against that office in some of those cases. I've seen the human tragedy that persists as these cases are defended for no reason. There's also a lot of affirmative litigation that the Attorney General's office should be doing on behalf of the citizens of the state that's not being done because of the misallocation of resources.
What's the alternative? If you get sued, you got to defend it, don't you?
The alternative is to carefully scrutinize a case and make a good faith determination that that case is not worthy of suit, and then settling the case early. Right now, the New York State Attorney General's office is notorious for not doing that, letting even meritorious cases persist at great public expense and at expense to the litigants. That should be changed.
Re-victimizing the victims.
That's exactly right.
The Democrats, as they campaign, seem to be campaigning, all of them, against Donald Trump. No. Critics of third-party runs, especially this year, are saying that you will perhaps distract voters and enable Republicans to prevail. How do you answer that?
In this race, I think the race will frankly be between me and the Democratic Party candidate. My track record is sufficient and significant enough to cause interest amongst voters who understand that I have a 40-year record as a civil rights lawyer, a constitutional lawyer, a labor lawyer, an environmental lawyer, a criminal defense lawyer. I have broad experience in the law, broader than all of the other candidates put together. So they'll have a choice. As I said earlier, voters need choice. So
you're saying the Republican isn't a factor?
I don't believe so. I think in New York State, it's obvious that the Republican Party candidate cannot win and will not win, may not get more than 30% of the vote in a race like this. The question is whether the people want a new course. The Republican candidate doesn't provide a new course because, as I said earlier, there's a duopoly of corruption in the state that involves both major political parties.
Explain that to me. You keep saying duopoly of corruption. What does that mean? I mean, there are two parties. They do disagree on things.
It means that together, those in power sit in rooms, divide up the riches, divide up the geography of New York State through a gerrymandering process, which is well known. Don't proceed to serious ethics investigations. You know, the Moreland Commission, probably a lot of your viewers remember that. The governor set it up with legislative edict. The governor decided it was getting too close to him. The governor said goodbye. And who protested? Did any Republicans seriously protest in New York? No. None of them made enough of a stink to even register. And why? Because corruption is duopoly. Duopoly means both parties are equally involved, whether it's Silver, whether it's Skelos, whether it's Sampson, whether it's another name. That's why more than 30 legislators in our state in the last 10 years have been prosecuted criminally. And one other point on that. They're prosecuted almost uniformly, not by the New York State Attorney General, but by the United States Attorney's Office. The United States Attorney's Office shouldn't be prosecuting our politicians. We have state sovereignty. We should be ensuring that our own political system has integrity. We're not doing that.
You're saying it's not happening.
It's not happening. There are no such prosecutions. If you look at every major case, as I mentioned some of them earlier, it's not happening. And when it was supposed to start happening with the Moreland Commission and its inquiry, the governor put his foot down, and that was the end of it. People criticize Donald Trump with regard to Mr. Mueller and his investigation. He's excoriated Mueller over and over again in his tweets. Mr. Mueller's continued to investigate. What happened to the Moreland Commission? It was squelched. It's gone.
Anybody on the Moreland Commission complain?
Not that I'm aware of, quite honestly. I don't think there's any record of it. I think that one of the leading members of the Moreland Commission was then appointed to the Chief Justice of our state Court of Appeals.
Janet DeFiore.
That's correct. So did they complain? Not that I know of. They accepted their demise, even though, from what I understand, they knew they were onto things that had great, serious magnitude for our state. The Attorney General in the state let it happen at the time, and again was more busy talking about Donald Trump. I'm not here to defend Donald Trump for 1 minute. On the other hand, we have so much to clean up in our state that it becomes something of a distraction for our politicians of both parties to be complaining about him. We can work on him. My view is that you're not going to have an attorney general with any experience in federal court unless you elect me. You want to sue Donald Trump in federal court? Both political parties are nominating individuals who have no experience in the federal court. How are they going to sue Donald Trump there?
Outline your courtroom experience for me compared to other people who've run for this office.
There's a system called PACER, P-A-C-E-R. It's a system that electronically records and chronicles the cases every lawyer is associated with. Mm-hmm. If you look at PACER for our federal courts, and in New York State we have 4 federal district courts: Southern District, Northern District, Eastern District, and Western District. If you looked at all of those district courts, you'd see that Michael Sussman has done over 700 federal district court cases. If you look at the appellate court, PACER, you'll see that I've handled more than 350 appeals, all in the federal courts. I've done a lot of state work, but the federal courts. If you look at all the opponents put together in the Democratic primary, which we're past now, if you looked at all those opponents, you would see 0. Now, these are individuals who want to be the top attorney in New York State. 0. The Republican candidate likewise.
You're saying none of those candidates?
That's correct. So
filed a case?
That's correct. And they're not listed as attorneys of record in cases or any cases. So to me, they're politicians. And the big difference is this. If you want to be governor of New York State, the stepping stone for governor is attorney general. I'm too old for all that. I'm not interested in being governor. I want to be attorney general. I'm not a politician. I'm a practicing lawyer and have been for 40 years. And I have a long track record of success in many arenas of federal and state practice. I've also had my share of disappointments and problems. However, I've overcome them, and I'm here, and I'm making myself available to the voters of the state.
Defenders of the AG's office point to prosecutions brought by the Public Integrity Bureau of the office.
Public Integrity Unit. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they actually do go after corruption.
Low-level corruption in New York State that they're allowed to go after. Local officials. Name one case that has been brought against a statewide official or a state official, and you won't find any. That's resigned to whom? The United States Attorney's Office. Why is that? We have our own political system to monitor and keep in check. Our Attorney General should be in charge of that.
Is that by jurisdiction or by choice?
It's by jurisdiction. The governor of the state has to delegate to the New York State Attorney General significant prosecutions of corruption. That needs to be changed.
In other words, if he were the target, he'd have to approve his own prosecution.
That's correct.
Previous attorneys general made headlines going after Wall Street, going after the Trump administration policies. Will you do that? Can you do that? Can you do both those things and still do what the rest of the Attorney General's office does?
As I said before, affirmative litigation, going after Wall Street, dealing with environmental corruption and environmental degradation in our state, going after Mr. Trump and his administration where their policies are both illegal and imperil our citizens, all are critical. I will make that easier to do because I'm going to stop defending in a knee-jerk way state agencies which really are behaving, occasionally at least, indefensibly. I'm going to divert resources which are being used now to litigate cases which don't deserve litigation. They deserve to be settled. You know, we have a mandatory mediation program in federal court for employment discrimination cases, many of which are brought against state agencies. In general, the state of New York does not participate seriously in that mediation. What you hear in the mediation is it's too early for us to settle. It's too early for us. We can't have a good faith discussion with the state AG's office in those cases. That's fundamentally wrong, because a lot of those cases are settlable and should be settled right out of the box like private litigation or litigation against other local governments. That doesn't happen in New York. I can give you two very concrete examples, historical examples, which will dramatize this. I sued the state of New York in 1987-88 for its contributions to racial segregation in Yonkers. This is after I'd won the main Yonkers case. I brought in HUD. I'd gotten relief from HUD, tens of millions of dollars to support assisted housing outside of ghetto neighborhoods. I sued the state in 1988. Mr. Cuomo's father was governor. That case settled 14 years later, in 2002, I litigated against the state and their attorneys 14 years till I got $300 million for the city of Yonkers. In other words, a whole generation and a half of school children who should have been advantaged by that money were not. The case was clear from day one. The state delayed, took every manner they could. In 2003 and 4, I brought a lawsuit against the state involving a promotional exam which was not valid for its purposes and blatantly discriminated against minority test takers. In other words, it was an indefensible test. If I were Attorney General, the first question I'd ask the New York Civil Service Commission, if sued, is where's your validation study so we could defend your test? There was no validation study.
They just came up with a test.
They just came up with a test that was not valid for its purpose. Okay? Now, they knew that from day one. It took me 5 years of intense litigation to get that test invalidated, and it's no longer used in New York and hasn't been used for the last decade, and $45 million for the 4,700 victims that we could identify of that test manipulation. The point I'm making is it took 5 years. It was clear from day one, if you were a studious student of constitutional and civil rights, you understood that was not a valid instrument. The state should have known that. If I'm Attorney General, I know that day one. I call the commissioner in and say, look, fella, look, lady, we can't defend this test. We're going to settle this case on fair terms. We don't need to spend our resources on this. We need to do something perhaps about one of Mr. Trump's policy. Let me use the talented lawyers in this office for that purpose. They can't be doing both.
Why do you think they do it that way?
They are trying to disincentivize lawyers from bringing cases. That's a very poor strategy when we have as much injustice as we have. For me, what's important is to purge the society of racism, sexism, and other practices which we don't need, which are holding individual people down. You see, discrimination, and I've spent 40 years fighting it, isn't just bad for the individuals. It's bad for the broader society because you're not able to make the contribution you can make to all of us. And we have to unleash everyone's talents. So that's my view.
You were once a prosecutor for the U.S. Justice Department.
I was.
Why did you leave?
Well, I went to the Civil Rights Division out of Harvard Law School in 1978. I started in October 1978. I loved the division. I was in the Civil Rights Division. We were doing very good work. On about February 22nd, 1981, William French Smith, who was Ronald Reagan's first Attorney General, gave a speech in Philadelphia at the American Bar Association, his maiden speech. And in his speech, he chastised us in the Civil Rights Division and said that we were not focusing on the most oppressed group in society, white men. I didn't believe white men were the most oppressed group in the society. And I didn't think my future was in that Civil Rights Division. So I went to the NAACP National Office, where I stayed for 5 years, began litigating the Yonkers case, and continued my career as a civil rights lawyer, doing what I think the civil rights laws were intended to do.
On that note, across the country, we're seeing more women and more candidates of color. I can't help but notice that you are neither of those things, a person of color or a woman. Sure. How does that affect your odds of prevailing in this coming election? Because, I mean, the Republican is an African American, and probably women on the ballot as well.
Well, here's the way I view it. The Attorney General is a singular position. That is, it's one position. And the person who holds that position must be the most qualified person from those available for the voters. It's up to the voters to weigh race, gender, or any characteristic in each of their votes. So for someone, the fact that other person's a woman may be the predominant factor. And I'm not going to argue one way or the other about that. That's that voter's choice. But I don't think you can have a system where you say, because I'm a white Jewish man, I should be disqualified from running. You have a chance to consider me. If you like my qualifications, if you think I'm the best candidate, you should vote for me. If you don't, because of those other factors, you have an opportunity to go into a secret ballot and vote. That's how I view it.
I heard you once did disqualify yourself on the basis of race. Tell me about that.
I did. Well, when I was at the NAACP office 34 years ago, Dr. Hooks, who was then running the NAACP, did ask me at age 30 to be general counsel. There was a bit of a scandal at the NAACP national office, and he called on me. And I told him there were 2 reasons I wouldn't do it. That was a job Thurgood Marshall had. And it was my view that an African American ought to be the general counsel of the NAACP national office. I was also 30 years old. That was a factor that would change and has changed in the last 35 years. But the reality is I still believe that in certain positions like that, which are positions in which you're really distinctly representing the interests of a particular group, even though those interests have broader social impact, you should still have a person of that group in chief counsel position. I was happy to be there as an assistant, but I didn't think I should be the lead person.
What kind of cases do you do now?
I do environmental cases, I do civil rights cases, I do sexual harassment cases, I do criminal cases. I do a broad array of cases in both state and federal court, and we also do appellate work. I've been the lead lawyer on the efforts to stop the fracking infrastructure in the Hudson Valley. That's the fight against CPV. I've been the lead lawyer in the effort to stop Legoland from coming into Orange County, where the zoning in the town of Goshen is totally unfit for it, where it's an most environmentally sensitive site. So I've been struggling with environmental issues and civil rights and criminal cases.
In Orange County, where you're based.
I'm based in Goshen.
CPV, explain that there. That's
CPV is Competitive Power Ventures.
It's a power plant.
It's a major power plant which is being built near the Pennsylvania border, about 15 miles from the Pennsylvania border. It will depend for its operation on fracked natural gas. It's being built 3 and 4 years after Governor Cuomo declared a ban on fracking in New York State, because fracking is too dangerous. Fracking is too dangerous for our state. But it's not
a moratorium?
It's a moratorium, but it's a ban. Effectively, it's a ban. Mm-hmm. Nobody's challenged it, and the moratorium has no time limit. So I'm viewing it as a ban, and that's how many people have viewed it. And it was done with the DEC commissioner, the health commissioner standing next to the governor, explaining the hazards and perils of fracking. Not only the exploitation of the fracked natural gas, which involves chemicals that are pumped deep into the ground and create tremendous water pollution and air pollution on site, but also the dangers of burning the substances that is fracked natural gas, the tremendous methane emissions, very significant emissions. I don't think we should be using those sorts of materials for the next 30 and 40 and 50 years in our county. Building new plants of this sort does that.
Why do you think it's happening? Is it campaign contributions? Is it business interests that are into the fracking infrastructure that want to market?
We know in this particular case, when you ask about the Democratic Party and the duopoly of corruption, one of the reasons that I came to the conclusion I'd be about the Democratic Party is the person closest to Andrew Cuomo, Joseph Prococo, who was called by Andrew's father, our former governor, Mario Cuomo, his third son, has recently been convicted basically of bribery and corruption for taking money from CPV directly to grease the skids for the CPV project. To me, an operator which engages in that sort of corruption should never have the license to operate a power plant in our state. We have all sorts of monitoring requirements, all sorts of accountability standards. I don't believe an entity which corrupts government should ever be put in that position. If I were Attorney General, on that ground alone, I would stop CPV.
You're hard on Andrew Cuomo, the governor. Tell me how you think, from your view, this pay-to-play corruption works. Outline it for me.
If you're a major interest in our county, Orange County, as you mentioned earlier, or New York State, and you want to gain advantage in the regulatory process, you have to make significant campaign contributions to those in power to get noticed, to get pushed to the head of the line, to get attention. Let me give you an example about Legoland in my county. Legoland, as I said earlier, wants to build this huge amusement park in a town which banned all amusement parks. They want to build it on the most environmentally sensitive area that the master plan in that town defines. So there are two tremendous strikes against them right from the beginning. You'd think it's out. The same town board had just disqualified a much less dense development from that same parcel and said, we can't do this. Too much traffic, we don't have water for it, it'll pollute our air. A much less dense project. The next month, Legoland comes, and 2 months later, before the review process even started, that town attorney is going before our industrial development agency called the IDA, looking for a 30-year tax break for Legoland. That's before the review process had even started, the environmental review process. And what we found were contributions being made by that entity to various local politicians, promises of all sorts of things from everybody from the Little League, the ambulance corps. They're going to be the best citizen in the world, even though they're violating every environmental standard in our community. That's the system.
And what did the Attorney General do?
Nothing. And the Attorney Generals have been, frankly, whoever they are, very docile, as I said earlier, about corruption in our own state. They want to talk about sexy issues like Donald Trump, and I get it. I get it. You want to get your name out there and attach him to some controversy. But the fact is, we have to clean up our own shop. We have to take those measures in New York, which are going to make our state and our children proud. We're not doing it.
Your record includes many accomplishments, but there's also a blemish when we go back on the records. You were suspended from practicing law for a year in 2002.
Right.
Does that affect your fitness for office?
Well, again, that's a question voters will have to decide. In 2002, I was brought up on charges that I commingled funds. Not that I took anyone's money. In fact, the hearing officer was very clear to say I didn't take 1 penny from anyone. My firm had a practice started by my father, an accountant, an attorney, in 1986. When we got a settlement check, we deposited it in our operating account, and we distributed the funds immediately from our operating account. That was the wrong practice. The right practice was to put that money in the escrow account, wait for the check to clear, then distribute the money. The grievance committee found that I had violated that in a number of cases, which I had done, and I admitted to doing. Not that I had taken anyone's money, but that I should have deposited the money in a different account. And the penalty was a 1-year suspension, as you indicated, which I took. I didn't complain about it. I said that I had committed a technical violation of the rules, and punishment was left to someone else. I came back to practice law and have done a number of significant cases in the last 15 years. The voters will have an opportunity to decide how to weigh that in light of my career. And I respect that.
How many clients do you have?
At any given time, we have several hundred cases that we're working on.
Several hundred?
Yeah, in my small firm. The cases range from education cases. I've specialized in special education law over many years. I brought some of the early cases on behalf of disabled children, as I said earlier, to sexual harassment cases, to racial discrimination cases, to religious discrimination cases, to criminal cases, voting rights, housing, a broad panoply of cases that are considered public law. That's what I've worked on.
And you have how many attorneys in your practice?
Right now we have 3 attorneys in the office.
3 attorneys. What would you be able to do with 670?
I can't wait for the opportunity. And I remember being in the Justice Department in 1978 and 79 and thinking that we had 37 lawyers and what we could do to make America great.
Let's go back to Yonkers. That was an interesting case. It was a landmark case. It was contentious, made lots of news coverage. It's the first time I met you, 1988 or so, those raucous beatings in the Yonkers City Hall. HBO made a movie about it, Show Me a Hero. Right. What was it like seeing an actor play you on TV?
I thought he looked a lot like me in my younger years.
John Bernthal.
Huh? Yeah. I thought I was pretty lucky to have John be playing me. Well, you know, of course, any dramatization of your own life is going to feel somewhat surreal, and you know, you're sort of reliving it all. It was a tragic case because Mayor Wasisco did commit suicide, as everyone knows who followed that documentary. The case dealt with a small part of the Yonkers case. The movie dealt with a small part of the Yonkers case, but I thought that it was reasonable. I'd helped David Simon as a kind of consultant to get some of the facts. The producer, the guy who did The Wire and many other very well-known programs. He was very genuine about it. He spent a huge amount of time and money doing it. I gave him credit for it. I would have liked to seen the African-American community depicted and developed a little bit more strongly in the documentary, but there are choices that have to be made, and I think he made good ones.
What artistic license did they take?
Again, the focus on that mayor and that particular time really, to me, was not the central issue over the 26 years I litigated the case. So that, in a way, is the artistic license, focusing on that. But he had to figure out some angle, and that was the angle.
You make a compelling case for your election, but you also have to admit that no Green Party candidate has ever gotten elected to statewide office. Why, with such long odds, would a voter, any like-minded voter, or any voter at all, leave their party line and vote for Michael Sussman?
Well, I think the biggest issue is each voter individually, as opposed to groups or defining it by groups, should review the candidates, their qualifications, their accomplishments, not simply their promises. I'm not so interested in promising. I'm interested in my history. When there was a center for the aged in my county that was about to close called Valley View, the legislature already voted to close it or sell it and allow it to be made into anything, essentially. The people in that center came to me and said, save it. And I found that there hadn't been a two-thirds vote as required by state law by the legislature to sell it. And I went to court.
Loophole.
I went to court and I stopped the sale, and it wasn't sold. When our county decided in 2012 they were going to redistrict in a way which shut out minorities from our county legislature, the groups came to me and said, what can you do? And I said, I'll do it. And I went to federal court and I stopped it.
So what are you saying to the voters?
I'm saying to the voters that look for accomplishments. Look for people who have used the law in a fair, equitable, reasonable way. Because after all, I'm a lawyer. I don't make decisions in all these cases. I bring the cases. The Attorney General, likewise, isn't the judge. He or she brings cases. I know how to bring cases that make significant change and vindicate people's lives. I've been doing that for 40 years. Other people are making promises. They have no track record. They've not been in federal court. They haven't litigated serious cases themselves. I'm the person who's done that. So to go back to your question, why should people consider me? They should consider me because of my track record, including the blemish. I say no one is perfect. I made an error. I rebounded from that error. I took my punishment. I've come back and spent 15 years doing the work.
With victory, there's always somebody who's not happy. A critic of your work in Yonkers reached out and said that, wow, you know, the city was bankrupted by that fight. I lost my job as a firefighter because of that fight. Michael Sussman's a bad guy. What do you say?
The city of Yonkers in January of 1988 signed a consent decree agreeing to certain remedial provisions. They were going to do certain things. 2 months later, the city council changed and balked and said, we're not doing the things that we were supposed to do. I went to court and said to the judge, they have to do what they said they were going to do. That judge agreed with me. The higher court agreed with me. The highest court in the land agreed with me. Yonkers basically still took the position they weren't going to do what they said they were going to do. Judge Sand imposed bankrupting fines on the city. He, that firefighter, should have voted for people who would follow the law. You raise your hand, you swear to take an oath, that oath is to follow and comply with the law. Not to make it up, not to behave in a racist and obstructive manner. That's what those city council members then did. The gentleman paid the price. I'm sorry for that, but it wasn't Michael Sussman. It was his elected officials who refused to act responsibly.
Is Yonkers a better place today?
Absolutely. It's a much better place today. And it's a better place for several reasons. First of all, the schools have vastly improved. If you look at New York State's urban schools, none of them are doing great. Yonkers is doing much better than Albany, Buffalo, Rochester. Just look at the data, and it's far better. It's not perfect. It has a long way to go, but it's much better, largely because of the funds we were able to bring in, the magnet programs, the specialized programs, much better. Housing is much more integrated in Yonkers today, and it has happened without all the negative naysaying that people said were going to occur.
And the state schools, the school system in the state, New York remains the most segregated school systems in the country. What can an attorney general do about that?
That segregation is contrary to New York state law. It's very simple. The attorney generals of the state have been too afraid to touch the issue. Michael Sussman is not afraid. People may yell at me, scream at me. I've had bombs sent to me. I've had people try to shoot me. I got it. We're here for a purpose. That purpose with regard to that issue is to make the schools better. And in part, that means to integrate our schools.
The election is in November. Michael Sussman is the Green Party candidate. He will be running against a Democrat and a Republican, and you have the choice. I'm Lou Young. This is Meet the Candidates.